Welcome to Do What Matters Most. This is episode 3 in the series, Current Trends That Are Modern Mistakes. Sometimes what happens in the world outside our family has little effect and can be disregarded. There are other times when ideas and social conditions are so widespread and predatory on the lives and minds of our children that, unless we are aware, our families can be harmed by our failure to be vigilant. In this episode, learn about 2 conditions that pose serious threats to the well-being of families everywhere, because they have been set free in our society and are currently inside our schools, our churches, and our neighborhoods. Dr. Scoresby then discusses 3 positive ways you can render these threats less powerful and therefore potentially less harmful.
In this episode of Current Trends That Are Modern Mistakes, I'm going to describe 2 of the biggest threats to families that are currently showing up in our society. And that's why I call this part The Gathering Storm Part 1. Prior to World War II, Winston Churchill began to write about the potential threats of the Nazis' political party and Hitler represented to world peace. Instead of being listened to by the nations around him and help them prepare, his articles and words in the House of Commons in Great Britain and mostly throughout other parts of the world were considered eccentric. After the war, he wrote a series of books about this period of time entitled the first one, The Gathering Storm, where he reviewed what he had addressed earlier. The purpose of this series is an attempt to define 2 of the threats to our lives, our marriages, and our families. I don't usually concentrate on threats because I think it's better to concentrate on positive or affirmative kinds of things that simply would bring greater success. But to win any struggle, it is always good to understand your enemies or the threats that occur in your life. In this case, the growing threats for us and for our families are usually hidden from those who are busy. They're often misunderstood and often ignored by many, and thought to be good things by many who do not fully comprehend how bad they can be. In almost every case, there appears on the surface to be something good about them. And so at first glance, we may not see them clearly, nor understand the implications for us and for our families. I am presenting this series as an observer, as a teacher, a university professor, a psychologist, and a researcher who has for many years researched, counseled, and taught about social and emotional conditions which affect the lives of families, including the parents and growing children. And by influencing people in these ways, they also influence our society in some fashion. I hope to describe 2 threats and offer some suggestions designed to neutralize and minimize the effects of these threats on us and our children, and then offer some alternatives or solutions that will keep us more successful and effective. As I mentioned, this episode is focused on 2 subtle influences which can have amazing power in the lives of our young people, and many adults for that matter. They are present in many situations, including friendships, schools, families, and neighborhoods. In my opinion, the nature of the influence often shows up in one small part of a greater collection, and so one single part may be thought of as unimportant or ineffective. Taken together, however, we begin to see the true significance of them. I begin with an article written by Joel Peterson, who published this article in the Deseret News, a Salt Lake City newspaper. Until recently, he was a professor of business at Stanford University. It is about an ideology or system of beliefs that he says draws upon neo-Marxism, critical race theory, social justice, and identity politics. That is, who you look like and the nature of your identity is more critical than merit or character. You probably know it by one or more names, like wokeism, but the important thing to understand at the beginning of this episode is that it is an ideology that claims to seek for greater justice, fairness, and eliminate all forms of discrimination, bias, and prejudice. Doesn't that sound worthwhile? The problem with this method is that there is no body of research, evidence, or even tradition which supports it. It is a set of ideas agreed to by many people who interpret this agreement as all that is necessary to support it. So if 10 people think the same way, then it is true according to those 10 people. Unfortunately, those 10 people believe that it is also true for everyone else. In the article he wrote, Mr. Peterson describes his experience as a professor and how it was canceled. That is, he was fired by his university for making some comments which others thought to be triggers or evidence of bias. The major points, as a few of them, I want to describe as follows. In this situation, these people tend to rewrite history. Stanford eliminated the requirement to teach Western civilization and instead applied the 1619 Project, which presents America as founded on slavery and stained in perpetual bigotry. And so in this attempt, they are rewriting what we consider to be the history of America. This system of ideology changes the basis of social judgment, that is, judgment of one person by another. One of the forms of moral judgment which perpetuated bias and prejudice was judging people on the basis of what could be observed, such as skin color, religious symbols, ethnic backgrounds, gender, and etc. The progress we've made since World War II is now being reversed in many settings. Here is how. Instead of understanding people in terms of their talent, character, and competence, something else is going on. According to Peterson, the basis of judgment now includes skin color to ensure diversity, gender to ensure a form of equality, and sexual orientation. And if one's language or actual social behavior does not conform to the ideology, then he or she would be labeled an oppressor. If this happens, then people of this ideology can threaten, apply a variety of types of pressure until an oppressor is canceled, or whose public discourse is reduced, if not eliminated, because some people fear tyrannical action. Well, what all of this means for us and for any parent is that we and our children are being asked to learn an ideology which is like a civil religion and use it as the basis for our judging and understanding social situations rather than focus on the inner quality of ourselves or others. Now, if you don't understand the implication of that, it means that our traditional notions of right and wrong or morality are being tossed aside. In practice, this means that a simple phrase can be used by someone to indicate or to identify an individual as an oppressor. For instance, Mr. Peterson said he discovered that when he asked an Asian student where he was from, this was interpreted to be racial in nature. As you might expect, the number of possible things which are judged in this fashion can increase remarkably so that it is greater than the number of rules the Germans had to carry out during World War II. They made up the rules, they made up the laws, they made up the punishments, they did whatever they thought was important to carry out their ideology. And we might expect that that kind of punishment or cancellations can evolve into many kinds of punishment and often worse forms of punitive reactions. Power and influence in this system where an ideology is involved is being those who judge and condemn. It's a little like ratting on friends. And further, groups of people like businesses can be threatened so that they either do nothing in response to this situation for fear they will be canceled and or boycotted. Even in this day, many large businesses buy their way into good favor by making large financial contributions to organizations that sponsor the ideology. Please notice there is little emphasis on cooperation, on acceptance, or individual differences that are acceptable. Now, before moving on, please consider with me what we are being asked to accept. First, we are to be much more concerned about what other people think, worrying that we might not be approved of, because the judgment made about individuals is often very subjective and based on others' bias. This is the core issue of anxiety, the core issue of neuroses, the core issue of fear and apprehension that influences people's judgment. This means, if we buy into that our focus and that of our children will be exaggerated toward externals rather than being aware of and understand a set of internals, such as responsibility, dependability, even compassion. Now, I have described the principal source of anxiety and insecurity, plus a sense of shame, guilt, and inferiority. We're also being asked to accept that greater fear is part of life on a continual basis, which will lead us and our children to more anxiety and depression, by the way, and suicide, which appears to be happening in many places in our country. Actions motivated by fear, unless there is a real threat, like a bear chasing us, are almost always lower quality than actions motivated by feelings of competence and confidence. Fear usually does not lead to anything loving and kind. We are also asked to accept divisiveness as part of our living experience, not diversity, divisiveness. It isn't diversity that is the problem. It is that separate groups are so divided there does not appear any form of behavior being taught to all of us designed to bring about a resolution between peoples. Now, before continuing on, please imagine what these conditions would do if let loose in your family. Children who learned these forms of behavior in school, for example, or among their friends, could come to your family and start questioning your role and practice as parents. If you are judged as an oppressor, imagine what that word can mean to someone in your family and others who are outside your family. Now, if you think this is not likely, then I would say to you it is only because you don't know about it. I have seen in my professional practice, for example, when people and the idea of sexual abuse and molestation was much more rampant, and there were organizations set up to check it out and to ferret it out where the kids are concerned, that on several occasions, children of a loving, kind family accused a father or mother of sexually abusing them as a function of anger and conflict, when in fact there appeared to be no basis of truth about it. Now, another major consequence of being judged by an ideology, as opposed to something supported by evidence, tradition, or moral value, is that an ideology creates a two-person condition, oppressors and victims, and those who appear to satisfy ideological criteria. In other words, we have oppressors, we have victims, and the people who are the judges see them as just two categories. They only have destructive purposes, that is, to destroy what exists, but when it comes to being able to satisfactorily replace what they wish to tear down, there is a long and loud emptiness, a silence. Other than destruction and negativeness, there is no recognized affirmative approach to solve any of the problems we face, but is instead a lot of bluster and fuss. Those who want power and money, by the way, created by simply continue to finding a new enemy or performing one new destructive act after another. Now, this might be challenging enough for us if that were the only thing going on, but there is more than one trend happening which will affect your family. This trend is described in the book titled Coddling of the American Mind. The authors are Greg Lukianoff, a constitutional scholar, and social psychologist Joseph Haidt. The central message of their book is this. In our culture today, they say, we have embraced three harmful ideas. These harmful ideas are, you must strive to avoid bad experience at all costs. So if some very bad thing doesn't kill you, instead of making you stronger, it makes you weaker. The second idea is we must always trust our emotions over reason, and in fact don't even consider reason. And then the third ideology or belief that we have subscribed to is that the world is a black and white battle between good people and bad people. There is no middle ground. Now, these three great untruths, these authors call it, contradict basic psychological principles about well-being and ancient wisdom from many cultures. They say that embracing these untruths and the resulting culture of safetyism interferes with young people's social, emotional, and intellectual development. It makes it harder for them to become autonomous adults, by the way, that's responsible and independent, who are able to navigate the bumpy road of life. End quote. Now, if their description of what they believe to be happening, they describe several social trends that have impact on our children up through and including universities, corporations, and so on. From their website, they write, the culture of safetyism explore changes in childhood such as the rise of fearful parenting, the decline of unsupervised child-directed play, and the new world of social media that has engulfed teenagers in the last decade. These authors examine changes on campus, including the corporatization of universities and the emergence of new ideas about identity and justice. They identify that conflicts on campus, for example, within America are rapidly rising political polarization and dysfunction, where in many universities, which used to be bastions of free speech and opportunities for dialogue, are no longer that. Well, what does all of it mean for us and our families? No matter our age or role, single, married, parents, or student, we will encounter someone or some situation that coddles us or believes that coddling is the best way to go. Here's an example. One of my sons took one of his children to a counselor, and the child said, I'm anxious, and the counselor said, well, if you're anxious, don't go to school. And when I heard that, I said, don't take him back to that counselor again, because what he needs to tell this child, a son, is that with some help and some determination, he can learn to be effective at school. Safetyism. Now, excessive use of smartphones, games, and internet exposure is an example of what teaches children that they don't need to face the reality of life. Many young people, for example, think that getting better and better scores on a game is the same thing as actual achievement. Or exposure to these electronic systems makes it difficult for children to have to create their own play. Think about that. When was the last time some child says, well, we don't have anything to do, so let's come up with something and play with it? Very, very rarely nowadays. So in the face of reality, what children begin to think and act limits their social contact, reduces the opportunity to learn some social and relationship skills from their actual experience. Now, the things we can and should do about both of these trends. I propose that what we still want is a positive, affirmative, and confident approach for living based on faith, based on hope, based on building competence, based on building in our children and our lives a great deal of unity and love and tenderness and cooperation, and that we must sink more emphasis into our family than we have heretofore given. For example, to begin with, I believe that it is necessary for us to give greater attention to the effects of faith in Jesus Christ. And that the reason for this is because this faith provides for people who believe it some things that give them great advantage. This effect will not be a sort of light exposure to him or casual religious life, but it will require devoted effort to ensure that everyone learns knowledge of him and of Heavenly Father and make it a central part of life. I know that there may be listeners who do not subscribe to Jesus Christ or to God or anything like that. I am just suggesting there's great abundance of evidence, anecdotal evidence, and tradition of large numbers of people who indicate that if we get it right, devoting ourselves in faith and acquiring knowledge of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, we get some real significant benefits. Another thing we can do is to realize that faith in him produces a form of intelligence and a stronger inner self combined with real experience. It provides what Jesus taught, provides both a history and a future, and gives all of us a chance to place in time that strengthens us. We now know where we have come and where we are going to go. One of the more remarkable studies that sticks out in my mind is a study about the brainwashing strategies of the North Koreans during the Korean War. It was really simple. They starved everybody, and then they gave food to anybody who would who would gossip or tell tales or ret on anybody around him. Pretty soon, because they were starving, they would tell bad things. They would make up things about the other people. When they were repatriated, the Americans who were there to get them discovered that as soon as a person in authority would walk into the room, the men would stand up and start telling all sorts of bizarre things about everybody else there. Now here's how that worked. They took every leader from them, and they took anybody with a college education who understood our history from the people who are the most vulnerable to that kind of brainwashing. What that simply means, that study means, is that there are some ingredients that we could supply that would immunize us or make us less vulnerable to the kinds of trends I'm talking about. Now, what we learn from the gospel of Christ is that we don't just view ourselves as individuals, but we view ourselves in relation to others. You've probably heard that 100 times or more, but think about it. Instead of being viewed as a victim or an oppressor or somebody bad or good compared to an ideology, in our system, and it could be Christian or anything else for that matter, we need to see ourselves in relation to others. Greater kindness and compassion, for example, are all relational terms. And these qualities are not weak and they don't make somebody weak. It turns out that it increases the strength of those who do it. We also need to learn to meet adversity with a desire to learn from it as opposed to being afraid from it. Here's a second thing we can do. We need to give much greater attention, in my opinion, to the development of a certain form of leadership. We should, in my view, make leadership a core part of every school curriculum and make it a significant factor in every family. Leadership which can unite people in something that builds rather than destroys and shows the value of people uniting to carry out agreed upon practices. Years ago, I participated in an organization called the Legacy Foundation, funded by Utah businesses. They wanted us, the owners of these businesses wanted us to do something to contribute to children. So we went to schools and set up a model for classroom teachers to use. It was based on a form of leadership that taught cooperation and visiting and plans. It was based on helping the kids become cooperative and help each other. And then we ran tests. And we have actual data that show that doing so increases academic performance in an astonishing manner. And secondly, what it does is decrease the kinds of problems because the kids are busy caring for. They still compete, but they do so in a respectful manner. So the forms of leadership we need are one that unites people and enables them to join in with each other to accomplish more. Two, one that invites people to do hard things and learn individuality while belonging. It's not enough just to do the work. It is important to create a certain environment where judgment of one another is based on competence, character, and talent. We can ask this for our schools, our families, for corporations everywhere. Our children need, in my judgment, to learn a successful and effective form of leadership. We can also make this form of leadership a basic part of training by parents of children so that every child learns about leadership, both in terms of how to conduct it and how to follow good leadership. Think about that. In addition to teaching whatever you want to teach your children in your home, I propose that we teach them leadership, because leadership is the method of uniting, bringing people together, and working towards some affirmative form of positive outcome. Another thing we can do is to reconsider what we currently teach in our families and schools about diversity. And we need to explore and examine several models of acceptance that do not include shame or guilt or arrogance. It needs to include benefiting from the strengths each individual can bring. We typically do not spend much time in our families teaching about others who are different than we are. We're often too worried about popularity or academic achievement or something else. But when we make as parents commitments to understand, learn about, and value others, we will also learn what it is going to take to make bringing diverse people together and do so taking advantage of the contribution of all people, but expect all people to contribute to it. Now, what if you don't do anything? What if you think this is those people? This is not affecting us? Well, based on the current research that's going on among social scientists, these two threats are slowly spreading their way first into educational institutions, educational systems, or school districts. They're showing up in some corporations. It will not be long until the organizations that affect and influence families the most will also consider it. It was not out of the reason, for example, that churches will begin suggesting to parents that they need to teach some of the safetyism or some of wokeism to their children. Rather than that, let each family and the organizations we support and sustain create opportunities and options for their children that immunize them and our families from these two threats. On the website, First Answers, there's a free program titled Emotional Self-Reliance, which actually puts into practice several of the suggestions that I've made today. It's free and can be easily downloaded, and if you're interested, I suggest you go there and get a copy.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Do What Matters Most, which is sponsored by FirstAnswers.com, where you can find new tools for families and parents of 21st century kids with a focus on emotional self-reliance. Visit FirstAnswers.com to sign up for a free newsletter. Find Do What Matters Most on Facebook and our website, mattersmostmedia.org, where you can ask Dr. Scoresby your own questions. Remember to subscribe to stay up to date with new episodes. Give us a rating and write a review on the podcast app or Google Podcasts, and let us know what you think about Do What Matters Most.